Good afternoon. I'd like to suggest that you come forward and be a little bit more welcoming and warm to our speakers and guests. You don't have to be that distant. And it's really a pleasure to welcome you all to this symposium on dimensions of sustainability. And the theme today is human dimensions of climate change. It's very interesting that we are meeting in a science building, and this might be a historic first, that we're meeting here for a symposium and have decided not to invite any scientist to be a part of the collection of speakers. Of course, scientists always will have their say, so we have, in that sense, Rob Stevenson as our moderator, but largely, the proceedings are going to be dominated by people other than those who deal with climate change science. And that is very important. It's very, very critical that we reach out to a lot of people and we hear various dimensions of the problem. And I'm not going to say much more than that. Reinmar will say more, except that I do want to acknowledge our gratitude to Ruth and Fuad Safwat. It is Ruth and Fuad Safwat Fund that supports these series. I also want to thank Rick Kessley, chair of the biology department, for his really continuing support and encouragement, and to my colleagues in the School of Environment, especially Robin, for making the slot on Wednesday available for this series. So, Reinmar, it's all yours.
Thank you, Kamal, and welcome everybody. It's great to see everybody here. It's the first time we've done it on Wednesday, so I guess there's more people from School for the Environment than we're used to on Fridays, and that's great. And there's biology people here as well, so we've got quite a mixture, and it's great to see everybody. The full title of today's event is Human Dimensions of Climate Change, Vision, Imagination, and Communication. So we're going a little bit beyond, as Dr. Bawa said, we're going a little bit beyond the natural science issues related to climate change, and going to be looking at the way people respond to climate change. And the image that I chose for the poster for this semester's symposium is, it's one of the iconic images of 19th century romanticism. Caspar David Friedrich was the painter, and he painted this in 1818 at the height of the Industrial Revolution that was ongoing in Europe. Just about the time when the multifarious uses of coal, the first fossil fuel to be used widely, were coming into focus, and people were realizing this was unbelievably useful if you want to get a lot of work done. And so, in a way, this image is sort of at the basis of the larger trend that we're looking at, which is now producing some very vast changes that we hadn't expected and hadn't anticipated. But this painting is interesting because it shows probably Friedrich himself, the painter. He was red-haired, and this character here is red-haired. You see him from the back, so we see the view that he has, as opposed to most portraits where you're seeing behind the subject of the portrait. So we see what he sees, and what he sees is essentially the result of a temperature inversion. So it's probably early morning, and he's gotten up there onto a peak, and he's looking down to the valley where the colder air has settled from the night, and there's a blanket of warmer air up on top, which is creating the sea of fog that he's standing in front of. Now this is one of the ways in which storms develop, and so to sort of bring it into the present, I could say that this is an example of the sorts of effects that we can expect to continue to become more and more severe as climate changes. Now, of course, this figure here had no suspicion that something like that would happen. The energy of the painting is in the background, but the focus, these diagonal lines coming down and up from the rock that he's standing on, the focus of the painting is the individual. And that was one of the ways in which Romanticism was reacting to all sorts of social disruptions and dislocations that were happening as Industrial Revolution continued, and people were already being replaced by machinery in their livelihoods and their workplaces, and all sorts of ferment was happening in society. I think this has continued. The pace of change is even more rapid. But we will, this afternoon, continue this focus on the response of the individual and of society to the challenges that are being thrown up, many of which are unanticipated, many of which are still unknown. We're going to be looking at unknowns and uncertainties this afternoon, but not so much what we might be more familiar with here, the uncertainties in the data. We'll be looking at the uncertainties as to how people respond or fail to respond to the challenges that we're facing now. So our first speaker, our first speaker is a psychologist, social psychologist from Penn State University, Janet Swim. Dr. Swim will be discussing pro-environmental engagement in social contexts, personal actions, and social movements. Dr. Swim.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and if I stand too close, evidently it'll reverberate, so let me know if you can still hear me. So thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to be a part of an interdisciplinary panel and to be speaking to a wide audience of people, and I look forward to hearing what you all have to say about what I have to say. So I am a social psychologist, and as a social psychologist, I'm interested in individuals in social contexts. So I'm interested in both how individuals perceive a social context and how the social context influences individuals' understanding and behavior. And what I'm going to talk about today is a particular social context of gender. Prior to my work on environmental issues, I did a lot of work on gender studies. And what I'm doing right now with this research is integrating some of the things that I had done in gender work with environmental science work. And this is a work that I've been doing largely with Terry Vesho, Stephanie Johnson, and Julia Dahl as our graduate students. So in terms of the gender context, so in the social sciences, when we look at differences, tendency to behave in pro-environmental manners, you find that women are more likely to report that they do it. Women are more likely to report concern about climate change. They're more likely to report that climate change is a risk. And so there's this gender difference out there. And so we're trying to think about, well, why is that? And what is the implications of that gender differences for engagement in climate change? And one of the things that people often talk about with gender difference is the idea that one reason why that happens is part of gender role socialization. So the idea that women are socialized to be caretakers, socialized to be nurturing, and to care for the planet is a simple extension of that caretaking. But gender role socialization is not just that sort of behaviors for women. You also have socialization of men. And the socialization of men, in contrast to caretaking, then is this toughness, this playing and you're roughhousing with people. And that has some interesting consequences for men. So part of the gender role socialization for men then is to be tough and powerful. And if you don't live up to that tough and powerfulness, you are thought about as a wimp. You're not quite there yet. So there's a lot of pressure on men to be tough and powerful, which then has some implications for the types of behaviors that they're willing to engage in. But another part of gender role socialization for men is that they are explicitly supposed to be not women. So they're anti-feminine, anti-femininity. And so that anti-femininity is often called the flight from the feminine. So men are engaging in behaviors to make sure that they are tough and powerful and that they are not feminine. And that, again, can potentially have some implications for engagement in environmental issues and topic areas. So historically, there's an interesting assessment of men's engagement in climate change. So back in the progressive era, in the early 1900s, it was a lot of the women's movements that was involved in the environmental topics, and they were trying to do it for social justice reasons. But then you have some famous people like John Muir, a lot of environmental scientists who are men and engaged in it. But this is an example of one of those consequences for men being engaged in environmental context. So this is a picture of John Muir when he's working on the Hetch Hetchy project to block a dam. And what you have is this little cartoon is putting him up as a woman. And they're trying to mock him for doing that sort of behavior. And so there's this pressure on men to not be environmentalists. That also extended farther in the 1960s even, when Rachel Carlson started working on the topic. There's a lot of issues about sexism against Rachel Carlson, but when you get into it in terms of men's willingness to talk about climate change, environmental problems at that point, there was concern, what they called a fear about being a bunny boy. And so men's willingness to talk about climate change, not climate change, I keep saying climate change because that's what I'm doing now, but environmental topics was suppressing men's ability to fully explain their feelings about environmental problems because they didn't want to be characterized as being feminine again. So what I'm interested then in our research has been, is the environmental context still perceived as gendered? And so those are historical notes, but is it still seen that way? So are pro-environmental behaviors gendered? So are there some behaviors that seem to be more associated with women than men? And concern about climate change itself, is that gendered? Because it's still concern in a nurturing role. And in terms of involvement in social movements and how you frame and talk about climate change, is that gendered? So part of my research will be about seeing first, is that still perceived as gendered? And another part of it is trying to understand what the implications of those are for those three same topics. So I'm going to go through those three things. First, the behaviors, then concern, and then the framing of climate change. So the first set of studies, what are the impressions of behaviors, pro-environmental behaviors, in people who do them, and is there evidence for the impact of that on willingness to engage in behaviors? So the first one is a set of studies where we ask people first to tell us what is your default, no, we don't say default, but what is when you conceive of pro-environmental behaviors, what are they? And we got a whole list of them, but the top 10 behaviors tend to be more likely to be associated with women. So the number one behavior is recycling, and people think women are doing that more than men. But a whole other set of other behaviors also are that same way. So for instance, organic foods, that's associated with women growing it or eating it. So that by default, when people are thinking about pro-environmental behaviors, they tend to think about feminine ones. But that's not all there is. There is also a whole variety of other types of pro-environmental behaviors. So sealing windows, fixing leaky pipes, those things become masculine behaviors when people think about them. So when you ask people about these behaviors, the default tends to be feminine ones, but if they're pushed to think about other behaviors, there are masculine ones. And what we wanted to look at then is what is the perception of people when men engage in the feminine behaviors and when women engage in the masculine behaviors. So we gave them this scenario. We said, imagine either Diane or David, they got one of those two, and this person is describing how they ran into their old friend. And they were line drying their clothes. They repainted their living room to be more reflective of daylight. They wore sustainably designed clothing. They've recycled everything, and they use reusable bags. So what is your impression of this person? And then another group of people either got Diane or David, who was doing masculine behaviors. So they donated to Ducks Unlimited to protect waterfowl. They worked in their car to make sure it was more efficient. They put tire pressure in their car tires to make sure they weren't wasting gas. They caulked their windows. They use online videos to reduce electronic waste. And so what is your impression of these people? And one of the key things that we found had to do with the impressions of the person's sexual orientation. And so when they were described as doing the feminine behaviors, and it was Diane that was higher on the scale, they're more likely to thought of them as being heterosexual. But when a man did them, his sexual orientation was lower. It's almost over the area of basically they're not certain what that person's sexual orientation. They don't go down and say that he's gay, but they just don't know about that person's sexual orientation. And then on the masculine ones, you get the reverse. So you get the tendency when David does the masculine behaviors, okay, he's heterosexual, but when Diane does it, she's questioned, her sexual orientation is questioned. And so part of this then has to do with the threat of having, for men in particular, because it's more threatening about this anti-femininity, is it the threat of people not really knowing what your sexual orientation is and the importance of not being seen as gay. And so one of the things we wanted to do then was say, well, given that, are there gender differences in willingness to do these different type of pro-environmental behaviors? And so we gave them a whole list of behaviors, and we asked men and women their willingness to do those behaviors. And there's one set of them that were the feminine behaviors, that's not spelled right, but feminine behaviors and the masculine behaviors. And what you find is that women are more likely to be willing to do the feminine ones than men are. But they're equally likely to do the masculine behaviors. So men are avoiding these behaviors, the feminine behaviors, and we would argue it's because of the way that it's portrayed and the implications it has for men and masculinity. The next set of studies has to be more generally about concern about climate change. So we wanted to look at what people's expectations are about whether men or women are more going to be concerned about climate change, and in particular, what are the traits that they associate with people who are concerned about climate change, and do those then have implications for men's and women's willingness to be involved in activist activities, climate change activism. So to put this in the context of some other research, when people are told to think about and describe what their impressions are of environmentalists, they tend to think of them as socially deviant. So they tend to be thought about as they're self-righteous, they're eccentric. And that leads people to not like environmentalists. So sorry, I know many of you are in the Department of Environmental Science, you're social deviants. But people think of you as social deviants, and that because you're, even if you're doing something that people like, you're out there telling them they're not doing the right thing. And so what our interest was is there a gendered component for that social deviance? And so what we looked at was trying to look at what are people's impressions of people who are alarmed about climate change. And first of all, people do expect them to be more likely to be women than men. But we had them rate them on a series of traits. And so we rated them, are they naggy, whiny, complaining? Or if they're feminine, they still could be nurturing, gentle, and sympathetic. Are they masculine negative? Are they aggressive, dictatorial, or arrogant? Are they masculine positive? Are they courageous, adventurous, or stand up under pressure? And what we find is that, like environmentalists in general, they tend to be seen as negative. So it's the feminine negative and masculine negative are stronger than the other traits. But within the negativity, they tend to be thought about as being whiny and complainers. So it's not just negative, it's feminine negative. So that then we wanted to say, well, what is the implications of that for people's willingness to sign up and say you're concerned about climate change? So what we did was we manipulated people's expectations about whether somebody who's very concerned about climate change is a woman or a man, or tend to be women or men, making salient the expectations or countering that. So we didn't want to just tell them the demographics of this group. We wanted them to just be thinking about it in the back of their mind. So we set up a study where we said, this is a study on memory. And we want you to memorize a whole bunch of sentences and the names of the people who said it. And the context was, when you're in a discussion, you're trying to remember who said what. Well, you can use mnemonics to help you remember who says what. So we gave them 4 quotes, and we associated those quotes with different names. And in one condition, they were all women. In another condition, they were all men. And in the third condition, they were equally likely to be a woman or a man. So for instance, in one of the women's one was for Julia, and it says, Julia says, climate change is a topic that needs to be addressed. Nobody seems too concerned about it, and by the time people really want to do something about it, it'll be too late. And so they either learn that Julia said that or Jack said that. And then they get these quotes, and they memorize them. And then they recall them. Then after they recall them, said, oh, by the way, we'd like you to know what your impressions are of people who are concerned about climate change. And so this case, actually, we found that they were positive. So they tended to see them as both feminine positive and masculine positive, but, and not very negative on either one of them. But what's important about this is this feminine negative one here. So this is one where we get gender differences in perceptions of the people who are concerned about climate change. And so what we find is that when the group is composed of all men, women and men see them the same way. But when they're composed of both equal numbers of women and men, or there's more women than men in it, then the perceptions start to change. So when you add women to the mix, they start to see this group as having more feminine negative attributes. So before they're generally positive when it's men, but when you add women into the mix, they start going, they've got these other attributes that I don't really like, and they tend to be feminine negative attributes. And then we also ask them, let's see, no notes. Yeah. So how interested are you in signing up for doing various climate change activism? Would you sign a petition? Would you go to a talk? A whole series of different things would you do? And people are more likely to do those things when they heard about men doing the behaviors. But in particular, we're interested in can we explain that? And can we explain that based upon their impressions of the group? And so basically what we have is that when the group is equal or more women than men, we know that men see them as more negative. And it is that negativity which then decreases their willingness to support it when women are involved. Or said in the reverse, when there are more men involved, they see them as having less of these negative attributes, and those less negative attributes make them more willing to be involved. So the gender nature of their impressions of the group are preventing men from being willing to be part of a climate change movement. The last set of studies has to do about the social movement idea itself. So social movements have their influence in the public by being able to frame the problem in such a way that can increase people's engagement in the topic. And they tend to define the way that people think about climate change. And so we wanted to see what are some of the impressions of the different ways that climate change has been presented to the public, and what is the implications of those, again, impressions of those different frames and framings. So the dominant climate change message in the United States, this is from some sociological work, is characterized by two different things. So the first one is characterized by the things that you can see being said by the 350.org movement. And so they say, we hope that fossil fuel divestment movements can help break the hold that the fossil fuel industry has on our economy and our government. So it's a powerful statement. We're going to fight evil. That's the way we're going to stand up, and we're going to be tough. And so there is that's one sort of message. And another way is the scientific message. So here we are in the science building. And so the scientific message, at the Union of Concerned Scientists, we put rigorous science to work to build a healthier planet and a safer world. So that's the scientific view. And when you ask people, who do you think said these things? They will say, I think men said these things. And that's the dominant framework we have in this country about how we talk about climate change. There are alternative frames. So this is from the National Geographic Society. The mission of the National Geographic Society is to inspire people to care about the planet. And so this is a very caretaking role again. Another one is a social justice framework, climate justice. So climate change is hurting people. These frameworks, you find them more in the South, the Southern Hemisphere, that is, not the southern part of the United States. The Southern Hemisphere is where you hear these sorts of arguments. You don't hear them as in the United States. But when you ask people who's saying these, they'll say women are more likely to say these things. And so we were interested again is, well, how do these sorts of framings then impact the way people, their impressions of people who say these things? and their willingness to talk about climate change and how do they talk about them. So we gave them a couple of different policies, and this one, I'm just focusing on one of them. So we gave them one, this is one we saw, it was promoted in England, was the illegalization of standby mode policy. So this is basically the idea, is to make the idea that the phantom load on your electronics can't be there. It's illegal to have it, it's just sucking up energy. And so they then read arguments that people associated with men in this masculine framing, or they read arguments that are associated with women in the feminine framing. So the example would be, adopting this policy would show the world that we are willing to step forward and be a leader in developing technologies to combat climate change. That's one that people associate with men. A legalization of electronics will with standby mind will demonstrate our concerns go beyond making our lives easier, but extend to the well-being of those harmed by climate change. So they got a series of these different arguments to look at and evaluate. And trying to make this short, because I don't have much time left, to get down to the basic part of it, when we had men evaluating their impressions of men who say these different types of arguments. And you'll see the same sort of pattern that we saw with climate change concerned. That when men say the feminine arguments, they're seen to have feminine negative traits, but they're also seen to have feminine positive traits. So they're seen to be more feminine when they use the feminine arguments than when they use the masculine arguments. And it doesn't seem to impact their perceived masculinity, but it impacts their perceived femininity. But what's important is the line that goes after that, and that those negative traits are then associated with seeing that the argument isn't as strong. And when the argument isn't as strong, they don't like the policy. So the argument decreases support for the policy by way of making them think about the person who did this has these whiny sort of characterizations. And so that decreases their support for the environmental policy. Women do something a bit different. They see them as more feminine positive, but that feminine positivity doesn't relate to the argument's strength. And so the gendered nature of the argument is not influencing women's endorsement of it. It's influencing men's endorsement of it. So I think I actually have more time. Anyways, I'm at the end. So I've been trying to go fast. I hope you've been able to follow it. So in the end, what the point being here is that the social context, the gendered social context matters. So in pro-environmental engagement and climate action is not just politicized. So we hear a lot about the politicized nature of climate change. It's also gendered. And those gendered nature of the way we talk about climate change, the gendered natures of the behaviors we ask people to do are going to impact people and their decisions about doing the behavior. And part of this, I think, is important to be thinking about in terms of whose behavior needs to be explained. So oftentimes when people are trying to describe somebody's behavior, they will try and describe the person that's different from the rest of the group. And so a lot of times when people are trying to describe gender differences in behavior, they focus in on women. So what is it about women? And that's rooted in the idea that who the normal person is a man, and what you need to do is explain women. But in this case, what we're arguing is that you don't need to necessarily explain women. They're doing these things and they're not impacted by the gendered nature. But what you need to be thinking about is, what is it about men? What is the qualities of men and masculinity that are impacting their impressions of these behaviors and their willingness to do them and to be engaged? And when we understand these implications of masculinity, per se, and masculine socialization, then you can understand how they can have implications for men's willingness to engage in behaviors. So masculinity basically is constraining men's pro-environmental engagement. They will do some things, but they will not go beyond those things. They will feel more constrained in terms of their behaviors that they're willing to do. They'll also constrict the acceptable characterizations of what environmental activism is going to be. When the dominant framework is one of masculinity, men are not going to be willing to say, or they're going to be more hesitant to talk about things about environmental justice and things about caretaking because of those implications it has for the way people will perceive them to be. So this becomes an issue then of rooting and thinking about these fundamental context of gendered context and how that influences the way men are willing to be engaged in climate change actions. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Sherman. Very interesting. So I think it's really interesting to see how, well, I guess this previous talk was an example of ways in which disciplines that previously haven't been connected to issues such as climate change are expanding to incorporate or to start to address some of the issues that are being brought up by this new challenge.